Imagine a bird that spends almost its entire life in flight, eating, drinking, even sleeping before it disappears into our dark chimneys at night. Welcome to Wild About Wildlife. I'm Kathy Mueller, and today we are uncovering the secrets of an urban icon, the chimney swift. They are one of our most understudied bird species. So, how are they faring in our ever-changing environment? To find out, I've brought in two experts. Glenn Barry is from London's Chimney Swift Monitoring Program, and Gabriel Evans-Cook is the Ontario Swift Watch Coordinator for Birds Canada. So, welcome to you both. I don't know, I'm of a certain vintage. When I hear chimney swifts, my mind automatically goes to Mary Poppins. There is probably no connection other than chimneys are involved in both. So I think we can be forgiven if we don't know a lot about these birds. As I said, they are not studied in great detail. So let's start there. What are chimney swifts? What do they look like? How big are they? Where do they live in Canada? Do they live here year round? How many babies do they have? Let's start with some of those basics.
For sure. Thanks for having us, Kathy. And I understand the Mary Poppins comparison. As a biologist working with chimney swifts for the past 3 years, a lot of people ask for more details about whether or not I'm cleaning chimneys, my relation to chimneys, am I doing Dick Van Dyke's dance as I look for the birds. But as for how to identify chimney swifts, Glenn, you've spent a lot of time out swift watching. Do you want to start with the visual characteristics, and I can kind of talk about the distribution after?
Kathy, you're quite right that they spend a lot of time in the air and only come down at night. They do feed during the daytime, sometimes at lower elevations, as long as there's food, because they're aerial insectivores. They fly through the sky like whales scooping fish out of the water, just scooping bugs into their mouth, sometimes very small ones and sometimes at a high altitude. But if they are around, within eyesight, you will probably hear them chittering. They have a distinctive chittering sound that once you've watched them a few times, you can't forget. And then you look up and see them swooping around and go, those can't be swallows because swallows don't fly that high. I see swallows close to the ground. And these guys are like an upper story in the forest when it comes to what, what bugs they're chasing. The classic description of the drawing is a cigar with a boomerang wings, a stubby looking bird, almost no tail, with a cigar shaped wing. As long as it's gliding, you can actually see the boomerang shape. When they're flying and flapping, they flap their wings way too fast for you to see the wing shape. In fact, they kind of act like cousins of the swallows. They're more closely related to hummingbirds,
Ah.
which explains how they can navigate up and down chimneys.
And then are they kind of the same they're obviously bigger than a hummingbird, but are they the size of a swallow or more like a robin or blue jay or cardinal?
I have not had two side by side, but when I see them flying in the sky, they don't look that much bigger to me. The pictures I've seen match what I've seen in the cage or in the carrier. This small dark bird, maybe bigger than a sparrow, with huge eyes.
Yeah, they're quite small as far as it goes, and like Glenn said, they're a species that's often seen before they're heard. The chittering description of their call is often what flags onlookers to the presence of chimney swifts. And as for where you can see them, they've got quite a diverse range in Canada, actually. And it's funny that most people haven't seen a chimney swift, but they've certainly shared space with chimney swifts. Chimney swifts can be found as far west as eastern Saskatchewan and all the way out into the Maritime provinces. And they go quite far north as well. We have observations of breeding chimney swifts as far north as Thunder Bay in Ontario. And any urban area that has any brick masonry infrastructure, as well as up into the boreal forest in Quebec, is all prime habitat for chimney swifts. So if you find yourself living in a city or a suburb, chances are you've got chimney swifts in your neighborhood. You just haven't seen them yet because they, like Glenn said, forage quite high and only really come down when the insects bring their attention towards the ground or they're coming down to spend the night. And when they do that, you'll hear them first. And then you got to keep a prying eye out for a very, very small silhouette that does resemble a cigar with boomerang wings. And they're very slate gray, so they kind of blend into the background as a more drab bird. They're not as eye catching as something like a vermilion flycatcher from the southern United States. But for me, they're just as charismatic, and they're full of personality and very, very endearing little sooty gray birds.
Okay. And they stay here year round or no? Or do some of them, like robins, some robins stay, some robins go?
So they're long distance migrants, and they travel all the way. All of them will leave throughout the winter, and they spend their wintering months in South America, as far north as Chile.
Wow.
Yeah, they go quite the distance. Similar to hummingbirds, for their size, they travel quite a long distance from their breeding grounds all the way up in arboreal forests at the northern extent of their range, all the way down to South America in the winter, and they do that twice a year.
Okay, so they're named chimney swifts. It begs the question, why are they called chimney swifts? My guess is because they sleep in chimneys, but or do they like why are they going into chimneys if they're sleeping while they're flying?
This is also a good question, and it holds a unique answer because it's kind of a very unique adaptation based on their physiology. Where it's one of those things where you're not sure what came first, the chicken or the egg, where chimney swifts nesting in rough, hollow trees, and then they adapted to that kind of lifestyle, or were they biologically leaning that way already, and that's why they filled that niche. So we're not 100% sure. But chimney swifts, unlike most birds, cannot perch. So a lot of us see birds on like telephone wires or on branches as we're driving through the city or down the highway. Chimney swifts can't do that. They're more like bats, where they have to hold a vertical cling on a surface if they're going to perch anywhere. And this is because, like you said, they live most of their life on the wing. Their legs are not very functional. They forage in flight, they breed in flight, they even sleep during migration in flight. So they come down to our chimneys to roost during migration, which is just kind of spend the night in rest, which they'll do communally in colonies of upwards to the thousands in the high cases, and sometimes just a couple dozen. And then throughout the summer months, they'll build nests in chimneys. They'll use their saliva like a sticky glue, and they'll collect twigs of standing deadwood and bring it into the side of a chimney and kind of create like a half cup nest that sticks to the interior of the chimney, which heavily replicates their original habitat, which were standing deadwood, hollow trees, and caves.
It's fascinating. And then in terms of their population status, people are knocking down chimneys or that they're not using anymore, or they're capping them. How is this impacting this species of bird?
That is kind of the primary objective of my work with Birds Canada. Is I coordinate a citizen science program to monitor chimney swift population trends, but I also work as an aerial insectivore biologist that specializes in chimney swift conservation. So what we're trying to do is look at all of the conservation issues that chimney swifts face. As a threatened species, they're classified as threatened in Canada, with a population decline of approximately 90% since 1970 in non-urban areas based on the Breeding Bird Survey, which in 50 years, that's quite a severe loss of population, in my opinion. So we look at all of the factors that are kind of affecting chimney swifts, and one of those you mentioned is habitat loss. And like a lot of species at risk, there's kind of a multifaceted issue at play. Like you said, a lot of chimneys are being demolished. In the modern era, our industrial brick and mortar chimneys are not the most effective heating system, and for many buildings, they're actually considered a fire hazard at this point.
One of the reasons we're losing some of our big, beautiful swift chimneys is that no one wants to maintain them because they're brick.
Yeah, it's expensive, right? Yeah, if you're not using your chimney, you don't have a fireplace anymore. I know in my own house, I don't have a fireplace anymore, but there is a chimney still attached to my roof. The chimney swifts are more than welcome to come and live in it. I'm happy to have them.
And I think I can add, why do they go into a chimney at night? Well, there's no food, the bugs are gone, so there's no point flying when there's nothing up there. And think of the effectiveness of a chimney at night as a thermal battery in the summertime. If you're a very temperature sensitive bird, not really great when they fly south to avoid the cold. But at night, they can fly as low down into the chimney as they want. to whatever temperature they would really like to be at. If it was a hot day, they can go to the basement. If it's a cool evening, the bricks at the top of the chimney are probably going to be warm. They cuddle. They overlap their wings. We don't see that in London because we don't see the insides of the chimneys. There's a few times a year when we can see hundreds of swifts in town with more than half of them going into one chimney. A lot of the time it's two, a pair, or maybe 12 in a chimney. We get excited if we see 12 go in one night. Oh, and I have to share my most critical identification feature of chimney swifts, and that is they're the birds going into the chimney.
Right. I guess if you see a bird going into a chimney, it's going to be a swift, right?
Lots of birds like to hop on top, but very few like to go in.
Right, right. Okay. So yeah, we were talking about, their population status, and you mentioned that 90% decline since the 1970, I think you said. So are they threatened? Are they endangered? Where do they sit on that kind of spectrum?
Yeah, they're considered threatened by Kasiwik in Canada, which is not quite as extreme as endangered, but it is certainly a species at risk, and it is something that deserves a fair amount of consideration in terms of conservation action.
You mentioned earlier too that they used to live in like hollowed out trees, right? In forests and that. Is it because we have just started, populations have grown, human populations have grown. We're building more cities, we're building more towns, so we're destroying that tree habitat, and they've adapted by moving into chimneys?
Yeah, you've hit the nail pretty much on the head. It happened pretty consistently across reports during like the Industrial Revolution and colonization of Canada, as British and French colonies came to Canada and began introducing agricultural practices, wiping out old growth Carolinian forest in southwestern Ontario and building settlements in clearing out a lot of wetlands in central Ontario, where all the freestanding deadwood was once kind of plentiful. It then became a health hazard to pioneers of industry, and we wiped out a lot of pristine wilderness in Canada. And with that, the chimney swifts lost most, if not all, of their existing habitat, at least in southern Ontario. And they did something kind of remarkable that we don't see a lot with species at risk, is they pivoted to a comparable niche, which just so happened to be all of the industry brick and mortar chimneys that were getting erected. And when you think about it, the kind of key components of what makes a good chimney for chimney swifts kind of just goes back to what made a good hollow deadwood tree is, like Glenn said, how does it thermoregulate throughout the summer months? And during spring and fall migration, it needs to be able to preserve heat through the night so that swifts don't get too cold. And in the heat of the summer, it needs to be cooler than the outside air. And it needs to have a rough interior for them to be able to cling to with their claws and their tail barbs, but also they'll need to make their nests in there. And there needs to be enough of them because, funnily enough, chimney swifts are really territorial when it comes to nests. They don't really like to share chimneys. So during the roosting season, hundreds and thousands, sometimes a dozen, like Glenn said, will all use one chimney and cuddle up and use that kind of as a jumping point to migrate further north or disperse before the breeding season. But then during the breeding season, each chimney or hollow tree will only usually house one nest, sometimes two, which is comprised of a breeding pair and sometimes a helper, which is suspected to be a previous fledgling who's not quite ready to breed from the last year. Almost more importantly, and this kind of is across the board an issue with global biodiversity, is the loss of insect biodiversity. When you kind of look at that as a prey item for chimney swifts, it's very obvious. We can just go, they don't have enough food, is usually what a lot of people jump to, but it's even more detrimental than that. It's not necessarily just about the quantity of food present, because we still see bugs all the time. The mosquitoes seem to actually be getting worse in some places. It comes down to how substantial that food is.
So are they a bird that is protected by conservation laws? Do those kind of things exist?
Yes. In Canada, at the federal level, chimney swifts are protected under the Species at Risk Act. Ontario used to have the Endangered Species Act, which also protected chimney swifts, but that was recently repealed by the Ford government with Bill C5. They are currently in the process of implementing a new species conservation plan, although how that is going to affect migratory birds is unclear. But chimney swifts receive habitat protection kind of unique to most bird species, migratory bird species, where when it comes to breeding habitat, your average migratory bird only receives habitat protection during the breeding season. So if I wanted to clear a forest lot behind my house, for me to be able to clear that lot, I would have to do an ecological survey and I'd have to get a permit. But as soon as those birds migrate south for the winter, it's a lot easier for me to clear cut that forest and build that shed. Whereas with chimney swifts, they are the only migratory bird, to my knowledge, that receives year-round nesting habitat protection for their critical habitat sites by the federal legislation.
And I guess that makes sense, right? Because if you said that they come back to the same chimneys, so I would assume that they would also return to the same trees or same forest.
Yeah, so they have really high site fidelity, as far as we know, where the same breeding pair will return to the same chimney, and it's implied that the young that are born at a chimney will return to the same area and then disperse from there. We're very lucky as conservationists to have policies like this for species. Year-round protection is so crucial when habitat loss is increasing at such an exponential rate, because if there was no protections, we would lose most of the chimneys pretty rapidly in the coming decades with how much development there is in urban Ontario. So a lot of my work is implementing conservation action, trying to get ahead of federal law, because like we said at the beginning of this podcast, most people don't know about chimney swifts, even though they're our neighbors and they're all around us, but they're surprisingly cryptic to a lot of the public.
So this is a perfect spot to bring Glenn back into the conversation because Glenn, you do oversee the chimney swift monitoring program in London. So tell us about that. What does that look like?
Before I came to London 5 years ago, there was a very active chimney swift monitoring program that had a number of volunteers who would sit in lawn chairs in pairs at chimneys that had been identified as likely swift habitats. The program kept getting extended throughout the summer into the fall. Here was something to count and to study, and it was a fun project. And I still get people saying, "Oh, I love meeting new people." You know, people stop us on the street and ask us what we're doing. And we say, "We're watching swifts go into that chimney over there on that church or that warehouse. And if you wait 5 minutes, you might see a swift enter." And half the time, more than one goes in at the same time, and people are just gobsmacked. The program has momentum. Volunteers drop off, but we're recruiting volunteers now. When things get wild and crazy during fall migration, and we have hundreds entering a single chimney, that news spreads over Facebook in town, and there will be people who hear about it that want to see the swifts in the sky. Swifts are fun to watch. It's an interesting activity. It's a very pleasant activity. But what Gabriel and Birds Canada care about is structured measurement, repeated according to a protocol. So we take all of this stuff that we do and package that for the observations that we have during the peak spring migration, but we also hang on to that information for the fall migration when it's time to release hand-reared swifts. There is a connection between chimney swifts and chimney sweeps. It's the chimney sweeps who knock the nest down into the fireplace when they clean the chimney. And that seems to be the biggest source of baby swifts that need hand rearing. Because I don't think anyone's ever restored a broken nest for chimney swifts and put the babies back into it and had any kind of outcome. In fact, I have never been inside a chimney, so I wouldn't know how to begin doing that. All of our observations are from the ground looking up at a chimney or at the birds in the sky overhead.
Yeah, I'm just picturing you guys all sitting out there with your lawn chairs, at dusk in the summertime, watching the
Yep.
chimney swifts come and go. And your point about the nests being pushed down, down into the chimney. I checked with our clinic before coming on for this episode, and they were saying that 5, 6 years ago, we used to see maybe half a dozen chimney swifts coming in as patients to Salthaven. And a lot of that was because the nests had been destroyed. But since then, for the last 5 or 6 years, we haven't had any swift patients. So we don't know. And maybe this is something that you could answer, Glenn. What kind of trends have you seen in the local population since you've been involved with this? And are we not seeing them at Salthaven simply because the numbers are dwindling?
Looking at 5 years of data, I would say not on my watch. They've stabilized, but something's still going on. When I look at the first arrivals, the last departures, how many at peak, there's stuff still happening, but I don't have enough years of data to know whether it's just randomness. Gabriel, are you able to tell if there's much of a change up or down and where that might be happening within the region?
For sure, and this is actually a really good opportunity because I wanted to give London its flowers. And when we talk about in your 5 year period not seeing too much fluctuation in terms of population, I think a lot of that can be attributed to, as far as chimney swift conservation goes, London as a municipality and Nature London as an organization are superstars. There is nowhere else in Ontario that has such consistent long-term monitoring that has been passed down through a collective organized process like Nature London. The chimney swift watch protocol that we utilize at Birds Canada originally came from Nature London and their preliminary work. And the city of London was one of the first big municipalities that we were able to partner with in terms of sharing the data that Nature London collects and putting that into environmental planning. So chimney swift habitat loss doesn't happen in London the same way it does other places, in the sense that if a site is going to be demolished, somebody knows about it, the municipality knows about it, and there's going to be a conversation about what needs to be done. In terms of the trends that I've been seeing, is I think the most notable thing that I've seen in my 3 years of studying swifts, of course I've looked at data before that, but we've kind of talked about the trend being a very downward trend over a long time scale. But it's also worth noting that that is primarily data looking at outside of urban areas. So places like London, Toronto, Guelph, Peterborough, Ottawa might be more stable than that 90% decline. Just not enough work has been done to know for sure. But the one thing I'd like to point out is I see a lot of inconsistency in terms of timelines. And I think these extreme weather events is something, whether that's wildfires or hurricanes during migration or all sorts of extreme climate events, I think play a role. Or it could even just be as simple as temperature shifting, warming faster, and then flash colds. Swifts, we do a program in conjunction with Environment and Climate Change Canada called National Roost Monitoring, which Glenn referenced as our spring roost monitoring dates. And that consistently studies over a 4-day period, in the last week of May and the first week of June. But through analyzing that data, we have a province-wide look at shared dates consistently. And a lot of the time in the earlier years, there was kind of an early peak on the second survey. Whereas in the 3 years I've been working with Swifts, it's been completely unpredictable when the peak of numbers is going to be, whether Swifts are going to arrive in the highest amount of numbers a little bit before these survey days start and we miss them, or they're going to start to peak near the end. I think that goes to show that climate change is affecting migratory patterns for chimney swifts as a hypothesis. Again, we haven't conducted any studies to confirm this, but anecdotally, I've observed a little bit more variability in chimney swift migrating habits.
Okay, so I'm speaking with Glenn Barry, who is involved with the London Chimney Swift Monitoring Program, and Gabriel Evans Cook from Bird Canada. And a couple of questions that popped in my head as we've been talking for the last half hour, and getting back to the lack of insects. So, pesticides playing a role in that? Is there a way to, like, how do you find that balance? Because farmers want to use pesticides to protect their crops, but then at the same time, then you're losing all of these insects. So is there a way to kind of find that balance?
Wow, this is a question that kind of it has followed conservationists since the introduction of pesticides. Unfortunately, we don't have a solve. There are issues with pesticides, but there's also a need for pesticides. And at this point, there is an over reliance on pesticides that we cannot backwards engineer. But this being said, that doesn't mean that all hope is lost and there isn't things to do. You can combat against the loss of insect biodiversity by fighting against monocultural landscapes. And a lot of the time we can look at that as mass agriculture, but it also happens in our cities and it happens in our yards. A lot of suburban neighborhoods have plain grass, mowed very finely front yards. And something that I often encourage as a very tangible thing that you can do as an individual to help with insect biodiversity loss and thus aerial insectivore prey items is gardening with birds in mind and putting effort into facilitating a garden even on your balcony of native plant species, native wildflower. And Birds Canada has a program that really helps bridge the knowledge gap because I know things about birds, I know things about vertebrates. I'm not a gardener innately, so I don't know where to start when someone tells me to plant a garden with birds in mind. But we have a program called Gardening for Birds, which you can check out online at gardeningforbirds.org, which will allow you to look at your own ecoregion in the country, and it will provide you a list of native plant species that could be beneficial for bird species in your region. And I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, because this is something that we always like to include in the podcast is how can people help, right? And that is something that's very tangible at the grassroots level, no pun intended, but at the grassroots level, right? That somebody can do in their backyard or on their balcony. And actually, we are one of our upcoming future episodes of Wild About Wildlife is I'm going to be speaking with somebody from a pollinator team here in London about how planting native plants. How do you know if it's native? How do you attract the birds, the butterflies, the insects, everything, right? Embrace the dandelions, I always like to say. My lawn is full of them in the springtime and the summertime, right? Just leave them.
We learn about it as kids. The food chain, it really does come into play with conservation.
Yeah, and then there was and this isn't something that necessarily somebody could do, I don't think. But while I was doing some research on this and I was reading about that fake chimneys are being built in some areas to attract the chimney swifts. Do you know about that? How is it working? And then if somebody does have a chimney and they're not using it anymore, what do you recommend? Do you recommend that they just try and maintain it so they can potentially attract a swift family?
These are very, very good questions, and they're ones I get a lot with my work. Lucky for you guys, I've got answers. They might not be as in depth as you want them to be, but they're what we've got. As for the artificial chimneys, freestanding structures, this brings me back to something that I definitely should have closed. Is when I'm talking about federal protections for chimneys and how they get year-round protections. I know there's a lot of people who might be listening to this podcast going, "Oh God, I can't ever touch my chimney," and that's a scary thought. But that's not the case. And ever since the Species at Risk Act was enacted, there was consideration for circumstances to which demolition or development need to happen, and it's very often that's acceptable and understood and appreciated. I've worked with people doing affordable housing developments, with people doing community center developments that just need to take chimney swifts into the equation. And for a lot of developers, that means you've got a couple options. You can try and preserve the original chimney, which is, in my opinion, the most effective form of habitat protection, and also usually, surprisingly, one of the cheaper options. Or you can integrate a new chimney design into the building that you're constructing, or what a lot of people go for is building these freestanding artificial chimneys that are specially made for chimney swifts and are often without a building attached and freestanding in a park. There's a pretty notable one in Christie Pitts in Toronto that there's a couple articles written about. They're kind of scattered across the province. Most of them are built as a benefit habitat for habitat destruction conducted by some kind of building being demolished or developed. Some of them have been built out of the goodness of their heart, but regardless of the cause, we are still working on figuring out why they don't work, because very, very few of them actually function as replacement chimney swift nesting habitat. The one I referenced in Christie Pitts is counterintuitive to that point, is a successful site. It has had nesting chimney swifts in it, which is great. And we have hypotheses at Birds Canada about what is the determining factor of the success of a freestanding chimney. But unfortunately, it is such a robust research question, because you can't just go, well, this one has them and this one doesn't. Let's just use that blueprint and put it over here, because we don't know if it has to do with proximity to foraging habitat. But my leading theory is that it comes down to insulation, like Glenn was talking about. The idea of a chimney attached to a building with internal heating, even in the spring and the fall, I think preserves heat in the colder months and rejects heat in the warmer months a little bit more effectively than a brick tower in the middle of a park just getting hit by the blaring sun. And that so far aligns with some of the things we see with successful artificial chimneys versus unsuccessful ones. And then your follow-up question about what to say to someone who has a brick chimney that they're worried about its deterioration. I'd love to encourage you to maintain it if possible. I understand that sometimes that's a financial barrier. Surprisingly, chimneys are quite an expensive endeavor. Brick and mortar industry is not what it used to be, and to rebuild something from a bygone era is becoming a more and more lost art.
Talking about how people can get involved in the conservation efforts. And so, Glenn, you said you're looking for volunteers. And if somebody here at the local level in London wanted to get involved and come and join you monitoring the chimney swifts during the season, how would they go about that? What's the best way to reach you?
I would just suggest they drop an email to londonswifts@gmail.com.
Okay. How many volunteers do you have right now?
We end up with about 60 names and 40 who end up being fairly active for the season. We've been able to monitor all the chimneys that we've deemed suitable for us to monitor. One of the restrictions is that some chimneys, some of the older chimneys, are in old buildings in less safe neighborhoods, given that most of our volunteers are older, retired people. And having two women sitting on the sidewalk as the sun goes down in an area that's really not comfortable for them to be in after dark just isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
As good as our numbers are, we know that there are swifts in town that we never count.
Well, you can only do what you can do, right? And it's great that we've got volunteers and people who are interested in London and across the province. I'm just thinking too, if there's a university student or somebody who is younger who is hearing about this, right? It's a great way to get involved and expand your knowledge about the environment, birds, whatever biology that you're studying. The thought came earlier too, is with technology these days, have there been thoughts of adding, like attaching a tiny little camera to the top of a chimney? Then that can take away the need to have people potentially sitting in an area that's not the best part of the city, and you're going to catch every single bird that goes in there. Are there those kind of thoughts?
I asked that question when I came to London, and I saw some really funny attempts. One example was someone who thought, I can't leave the camera there forever running, so let me use something that's motion activated. Well, the Swifts were too fast. But you're absolutely right. Every year, bird watching technology gets better and better and better. Just to finish your idea about the university, we do have active involvement from the University of Western Ontario. One student did her fourth year project paper using 20 years of our data and was supervised by one of the biology professors. And they were active even after their daughter left the program. These two professors continued to monitor with us all last year, and I'm really counting on them to come back because they're great ambassadors within the university. But to be fair, there's a sign on a university building saying that chimney up there is used by chimney swifts. And thousands of University of Western Ontario students pass that sign every day and wonder why I'm in a lawn chair looking at that chimney.
Right. Well, and like I've heard many times on this podcast from other guests, that what we try and do is raise awareness through this podcast, right? And through Salthaven in general, we have a big and strong education component to our mandate. And what I've heard from a lot of guests on the podcast is that if you aren't aware about it, if you don't know about the issue, about the challenge, then you can't care about it. So hopefully we've intrigued at least a few people today to learn a little bit more about chimney swifts. Thank you both for joining me today. It was a fascinating conversation. I think we could continue talking for a full other hour and still not have covered this topic entirely. So might have to have you back on at some point. If you want to learn more about chimney swifts or get involved in conservation efforts, I'm including links to various resources, including Birds Canada. I'll put the Gmail account to reach out to Glenn if you're interested in volunteering locally. Those will all be in the episode notes. And I'm always interested, of course, in hearing your ideas on what wildlife we should be focusing on in upcoming episodes of Wild About Wildlife. So email me with your thoughts, your questions, and you can reach me at wildaboutwildlife@salthaven.org. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you next month.